In this video, we will go over how to use the cluster tool in our spatial products. The cluster tool allows you to build clusters or districts using both geographic and non-geographic parameters. In this example, I have some outlets plotted on a map, and I will be using store location and weekly time in store as the parameters to build my clusters. First, we will bring up the tool, which can be found in the Tools tab over here, or can be searched for in the search bar. As I click on the tool, it brings up the Cluster Designer dialog, and in the first tab, Settings, we will choose the layer that you will be doing the clustering on. In this case, it's my outlets layer. Then you will choose the cluster field, where the cluster values will be populated once your clustering is done. You can choose an existing field in your data. Note that if you have values already in that field, they will be overwritten once the clustering is done. In this case, I'm going to choose to create a new cluster field instead, and I will call it cluster. Next, in the grid below, you will choose the field or fields in the data that you want to aggregate on to use as a guide when creating your clusters. And like I said, I'm going to be using weekly time in store, so I will choose that and drop down on field and choose that column in my data. Then you will choose the aggregation type, which will be sum in this case. You can then click below and choose more fields to aggregate on. In this case, I only want to use that one, so I am done. We can now go on to the Clusters tab and begin creating our clusters. By cluster name, type in the name of the first cluster that you will be creating. This I will call cluster 1 here. Then you can choose the color for that cluster. This will be the color that your elements or points will be colored by in that cluster. In this case, I will take the default as it looks good to me. Then you will go to your map and choose one of the selection tools, so you can start selecting elements to add to your first cluster. You can choose a box selection tool, or you can use the polygon selection tool to choose a more precise area to select. I've selected my first group of points that I want to add to my cluster. As I have selected them, it is shown in the selected items box the number of items selected. This is also shown in the cluster designer here that 48 items have been selected, and the aggregated value that I chose is also displayed for me for those 48 outlets, and that is weekly time in store. If I'm happy with that weekly time in store and the number of outlets in that cluster, I will then say add selected. And as I do that, the points are added to the cluster and colored accordingly. The number of points in that cluster is put here, as well as the aggregated value that I chose. I can then create my next cluster and type it in. I'm happy with that color. I will then go and choose my next set of elements to add to my cluster. As I choose them, the number of selected items is populated, as well as the aggregated value of weekly time in store. I'm happy with that, and I will say add selected. As I do that, the points are added and colored accordingly, along with the number of items in that cluster and the aggregated value. I'll continue creating clusters in this way. When I'm done, I can simply exit this dialog. This data will still be here for me if I want to come back to it. But for now, I'm happy, so I will exit. Now, as you'll see by your layer, once you've done your clustering, an automatic theme is created for you based on the clusters you created. And to see where this cluster data actually is in your data, we can go to View Data. And I will just scroll to the end here, and you will see the cluster field that I chose to be created was added for me. And my cluster data is in there and populated for me. As I come back here, because of this theme that's been created for me, I can tick clusters on and off that I want to see. and zoom to them. We will now go over adding, moving, and deleting points in a cluster. If we open up the cluster tool again, we will see all our data we had before is there. Cluster 1 and cluster 2 that I created. And now, if I want to, for example, add some points to cluster 1, this is how you can do it. First, from the cluster name, select from the drop-down the cluster that you want to add to. In this case, it will be cluster 1. Then go to your scene, use one of the selection tools, and select the points you would like to add to this cluster. So I would like to add these two here, and maybe this last one over here. Once I've done that, I can simply click Add Selected. And those points are now added to my cluster 1 and are colored accordingly, as you can see. You can see the count of the points in cluster 1 has updated from 48 to 51 now, and so has the aggregated value updated. Now, if you want to remove points from a cluster, this is how you can do it. In this example, let's say I want to remove points from cluster 2. I'll first go to the cluster name field here and select from the drop-down cluster 2. Then I'll go to my scene again using one of the selection tools and select the points from cluster 2 that I would like to remove. So let's say I want to remove this area here of points in cluster 2, I'll select them. Then when I come to cluster 2, I can expand this arrow over here and it will show me the selected points. So I've selected 7 points in cluster 2. Then I can drop down further on the selected, which will bring up a list of the exact selected points in cluster 2. Then what I'll do is I can delete individually points in cluster 2 here by right-clicking and saying remove from cluster. If I want to remove all of them, I'll just highlight all of them that I selected over there, and then I can right-click and say remove from cluster. And as I've done that, if I now clear my selection, you'll see those points are no longer colored in the light blue color of cluster 2 as they have been removed. And also in cluster 2 itself, the count of number of points has updated and is now less, and so is the aggregated value. Lastly, we will go over how to move points from one cluster to another. So in this example, let's say I would like to move some of these cluster 2 points to cluster 1. So what I'll do is, from cluster name field dropdown, I will click on cluster 1 because that is the cluster I'm going to be adding to. Then I will come to my scene, and then I'll select the points in cluster 2 that I want to add to cluster 1. So it'll be these points over here. Selected them. Once I've selected them, I can simply again say Add Selected. And as I've done that, you see these points have now been colored differently and added to cluster 1. And the count of cluster 1 is updated as well as the aggregated value. And that is all for this demonstration. Thank you very much.